Final Fantasy III, the final chapter of the 8-bit era. After the success in Japan of Final Fantasy II, selling about 30% more copies over the original Final Fantasy in Japan, it was inevitable that a third entry would come along. Final Fantasy III would prove to be the most ambitious title to date, attempting to implement systems from the first two entries while also establishing its own identity with some groundbreaking additions. Final Fantasy III was released in April of 1990 for the Japanese market. Interestingly, the US version of the Final Fantasy I wouldn't see its release until July of this same year. Since the US version of Final Fantasy II and III would have been so far behind the release dates of their Japanese counterparts, and with the Super Nintendo on the horizon, Square was reluctant to spend the money on localizing and releasing the games in the US. With the amount of money required to localize a game, it would be a dangerous gamble for the studio to spend the resources to port the second or third titles at this time. It wouldn't be until 2006 that the US would finally see an official port of Final Fantasy III on the Nintendo DS, 16 years after its original Japanese release date. Final Fantasy III would prove to be Square's most successful title to date, and would go on to sell nearly as many copies as Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy II combined. I had the absolute pleasure of being able to play the Pixel Remaster version on our Final Fantasy Friday series, which was live on both of my Twitch and my YouTube channels. Once again, my party was named after some of my patrons, and so for the entirety of this review, they are named Travesty, Demon RHK, Huey, and returning to, and actually being a contributing member to the party in this entry, Funky Walt Dog. Now before we get started with the story and review of the game, here is the track that I have chosen to remix for this entry, entitled Started Onion, Now We Here. Upon starting Final Fantasy III, we are greeted with the ever-familiar prelude piece as we enter in our characters' names. Then, we are immediately thrust into the world, controlling 4 onion kids that were playing a game and fell down a hole. As we make our way through the cave, we are introduced to the combat system of the game, and initially it feels exactly like the first 2 entries, but more on that in a moment. As we near the end of the cave, we beat up a turtle, and we find a crystal in front of us. This crystal claims that we are the heroes of light, because, of course we are, because, well, who else could it be? And it gives us the single most defining feature of this game, jobs. That's right, we don't have to grow up, throw our resume at a bunch of automated applications only to earn enough gil to purchase a gold needle after 2 years. Nor do we have to count on the allowance that we are given to be able to afford bombs. Having never played this game completely until this series, I knew that Final Fantasy III was the first time that Square used the job system, and I wanted to compare it to its fantastic future iterations in Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy V. The job system allows you to completely customize your playthrough by dedicating a character to an archetype. There are a total of 21 jobs in the Pixel Remaster, with slight differences coming from other versions of the game. The jobs vary from physical attackers like the Warrior, Black Belt, and Dark Knight, to the more magic-focused classes such as the Black Mage, White Mage, and Geomancer. The class system even has some unique classes such as the Bard or Thief that add more versatility to your party. For example, the Thief allows you to open locked doors during exploration, which happens to be a non-combat skill. Most jobs give you access to unique skills that define the archetype, and would lay the foundation of Final Fantasy classes for years to come. Dragoons take to the air to attack from above with their jump ability, while the Bard serenades the party to provide buffs and healing. and the Geomancer uses Mother Nature's wrath to demolish your enemies. Now with jobs come job levels. As you gain experience, each job levels up, which allows the character to become more proficient in their job-specific abilities. For instance, as a character gains job levels in Black Mage, they will be able to cast additional spells. A bard will learn new songs that they can sing, and physical damage characters increase the amount of times that they hit and their overall damage. Now before I continue, I cannot help but point out how well this job system works in Final Fantasy III, and to be impressed at the solid implementation for Square's first attempt at a major fundamental change to the series. Looking at all of the systems that Final Fantasy II attempted to add while failing to hit the mark, Final Fantasy III really knocks it out of the park by comparison. The first jobs awarded by toppling the tormented turtle Terry are some of the staples of the franchise: the Warrior, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage. Whenever I play an RPG, I am 100% basic. I love me a 2 physical damage dealer, 1 DPS caster, and a healer. So, well, let's roll with that. As we leave Terry the Turtle's cave and head to our hometown, we immediately begin our inevitable quest of heroism. The first task we are given is to find a mithril ring to break a curse and rescue Princess Sarah. I found this to be funny for 2 reasons. Roughly 5 minutes ago, we were kids playing hide and seek, but after one quick crystal conversation, we are suddenly entrusted with a huge responsibility. The second point of humor is the return of Princess Sarah, where the princess from Final Fantasy I was also named Sarah, and there will be more inclusions of Sarah in the future. She is not the only recurring character, however, as we also quickly meet Sid, who makes his return in this game as yet another airship aficionado, but just wanted to mention it. Now, although I won't go heavily into the story of this game, in my opinion, it is a step up in storytelling from what Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy II attempted. The way that Final Fantasy III presents the narrative and the overall story arc is laden with the tropes of the JRPG formula that was still being established during this era. The heroes are destined to save the world. They meet interesting and zany characters along the way, they fight the evil bad guy who turns out to be not quite as evil as the actual evil bad guy. Then they kill the actual evil bad guy, and then the credits roll. The story itself has quite a few unique moments. One of my favorite is finding out that the world is actually a floating continent, and upon obtaining a specific airship, you get to explore the world underneath it, unlocking an entire new map to discover. But wait, there's more! After further progress, we get access to a yellow submarine, which allows us to explore the abyss. I absolutely loved that the world building happens narratively. There are lore reasons as to why the world behaves the way that it does. We learn that the planet was flooded due to the water crystal's corruption, and it had turned all of the inhabitants of the world to stone. I mean, I guess it could have been worse, at least they didn't drown. The floating continent exists due to the wind crystal's influence lifting it up above the doomed, flooded world. After finishing the water temple and cleansing the corruption, the world becomes unflooded and life returns. Not only is this an excellent early attempt at using world building to craft an immersive experience, but also gives the player agency within this world. Final Fantasy III makes remarkable progress in storytelling and world building, crafting the blueprint for future entries in the series and giving us a taste of the grandiose adventures that define the franchise. The dungeon design of this game is a vast step up from Final Fantasy II. Most areas do not have that Mario Maker-esque influence of the pick-a-door problem that we discussed in my review of Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy III's dungeons have some new wrinkles that on paper sound amazing, but also in practice do miss the mark. Now to elaborate, there are specific dungeons that require you to have a certain status ailment to proceed, such as Minnie or Toad. This design choice adds an unnecessary layer of frustration as it nullifies the effort that you have put into certain character jobs, as they become less viable for making timely progress. In the dungeon where everyone has to have the mini status, the only way to reliably do damage is to have magic users carry the party, as your physical damage dealers pack the punch of a wet noodle. And another example in a dungeon in the latter half of the game requires the party to consist of at least one Dark Knight, as the enemies will respawn if killed by any other physical damage class, which does tarnish the flexibility and creative stylings that I had praised earlier in this review. This idea of forcing a certain job class makeup brings me to one of my most poignant critiques of this game. Although you are given the opportunity to customize your party however you see fit, you are pigeonholed into having a specific party makeup through many areas of the game. Now, as we play, we learn that the cleansing of the corrupt crystal will unlock new jobs for us to try. While this should have been the most exciting part of the game, in almost every single case, unlocking the jobs was a bittersweet experience. Imagine, if you will, Christmas morning, and you just got a bunch of brand new presents. However, they all require batteries, and your parents are fresh out, and all the stores are closed till tomorrow. This is what getting new jobs feels like in Final Fantasy III, where the jobs are the presents, and all the gear and spells you need are the batteries. Because for various reasons, you cannot obtain the gear that you need immediately. This was blatantly obvious when I arrive on the land for the first time after unflooding the world. However, due to story reasons, my airship was inaccessible. So I only had one town to gear up or purchase spells for, and this town did not carry any of the equipment or spells for several of the classes I had just unlocked. During these playthroughs, I tend to give my Patreon chosen party members the option of telling me what kinds of classes and what kind of playstyle they would like to be. And unfortunately, Final Fantasy III doesn't really let you have that kind of freedom. For example, you will always need a white mage / dedicated healer throughout the entire game, as no other classes will have a similar healing potency. At one point, I tried to use a bard as the main healer, and he just couldn't keep up with the damage that we were consistently taking in the more challenging encounters. Now, speaking of challenging encounters, Final Fantasy III does something remarkable for the series, and for JRPGs as a whole: optional endgame content. With the first showing of the Summoner class in the franchise, Final Fantasy III added several optional fights and dungeons to earn the most powerful summons. The addition of optional content was absolutely groundbreaking for the time. For instance, early in the game you find a pool of water with what appears to be the Loch Ness Monster or some kind of large eel, but you are unable to get to the area with your current airship. Once you obtain the last airship, the Invincible, which, side note, is apparently the only airship to exist that can fly over mountains because of, well, honestly, I have no damn clue as to why we lost our first airship, because we chose to fly it into a boulder to clear the boulder out of a way instead of, flying over it. But anyways, I digress. So anyway, we take the Invincible and fly over the mountains. We disembark, take our canoe over to the eel, entering Leviathan's lair. Now this was a tough fight, but upon defeating Leviathan, we can now use him with our summoner Huey. Also, side note, it is better to be lucky than good. Check out this fight. Nah, the game just does that. It'll just start choosing the same thing. See? He'll change it up. Come on. Oh shit! Oh fuck! All of this optional endgame content and acquiring the summons and the Eureka weapons, coupled with experiencing the game from the Pixel Remaster version, really made the game feel like it was from the golden era of Squaresoft in the 1990s. Now, one thing I have yet to talk about is how the magic system works in Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III returns to a spell level cast limit as opposed to magic points in Final Fantasy II. However, the spells per level are no longer capped at 9, which is not nearly as limiting as Final Fantasy I's paltry spell pool. One thing I found really odd about the magic system is the distinct hierarchy of classes. For instance, the White Mage is outclassed by the Devout, and the Sage outshines them both by not only having a larger spell pool, but also being able to cast black, white, and summoning magic. Just like all the physical damage dealers are outclassed by the ninja, which can use all weapons, armor, and hits like a dry noodle instead of a wet one, so you know you're gonna feel it. The common endgame makeup is 2 ninjas and 2 sages, which is easily one of the strongest parties. My personal endgame party ended up being 2 ninjas, a sage, and a summoner for some variety. I would be remiss if I didn't mention how big of an influence this game had, not only on the franchise, but within the entire genre. Having played through the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV, it was really cool seeing the sheer amount of lore that was taken from 3 that was used to drive the narrative of the later game. It makes me wish that I had played 3 before 14, so that I could have fully understood all of the references to its predecessor. Final Fantasy III would also go on to heavily influence job systems in later titles like Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy Tactics, Octopath Traveler, Bravely Default, and many others, just to name a few. So, does Final Fantasy III still hold up today? Well, I cannot say that the Famicom version holds up quite as well just due to all the quality of life improvements from the later ports. I would definitely say that overall this game does hold up. Honestly, you can't go wrong with any of the ports that have been released. I had a ton of fun with the Pixel Remaster version. I am extremely happy to be creating this review series, as there are some decent amount of Final Fantasy games that I have personally never finished, but I'm really excited to get through now, not only because of the fact that it's new to me, but I get to see everything that Square was trying with each and every title. Final Fantasy III really brings the best that the first and second titles had to offer, and bundles them into a tight package that made me feel nostalgic, even though this was my first complete playthrough of the game. Although Final Fantasy III was the last Final Fantasy title of the 8-bit era, it was just a precursor of what was to come. After this, the franchise enters into the 16-bit era, on the revolutionary Super Nintendo, and would become some of the most memorable and impactful games of my life. Also, if you've played through Final Fantasy III, let me know what your favorite part was in the comments. Once again, I'd like to highlight my patrons on Patreon, as I literally would not be able to continue to produce content at the rate that I do. This includes streaming, creating music, and of course, these video series, without your continued support. Thank you so much. Lastly, my fellow warriors of light, praise be to Yevon.